Imagine going from an ordinary blacksmith to a demon sword wielder who now has to fight the urge to separate all the heads in the world from their bodies. Meet Guy, pronounced Guy, not gay. Born cursed, abandoned as a baby, lost an arm, and gets a metallic arm in replacement that apparently was sent from the pit of hell. Now Guy has to live out his days in total despair of becoming the reason why heads roll like dice. Apparently about 2,000 years ago in the Roman era, a group of brainless barbarians stormed a small village outside the empire. The villagers, with their survival instincts that matched that of a rock, were completely unprepared and got massacred. Their priest tried praying, but apparently the gods were busy. So, like every desperate fool in history, they started sacrificing sheep and calling for demons instead. Their cries were answered, but not in the way they expected. A lone knight arrived, wielding the infamous demon sword. The moment this guy unsheathed the blade, the battle was over in an instant. The barbarians ran like they had just seen their in-laws. The villagers were relieved, so what did they do? They lined up to thank him, conveniently forgetting that they had prayed to a demon, not a saint. The knight, who clearly didn't sign up for a gratitude parade, wasn't there to save them, he was there to destroy everything. This was no bedtime story, and if it is, you won't be sleeping sound and safe. Fast forward to the present, where a group of explorers stumbled upon an ancient tomb. As they ventured deeper, they found something glowing: the demon sword. Before they could celebrate, another group arrived. What's an ancient treasure hunt without some party crashers? A fight broke out, and one unlucky fool grabbed the sword. Within seconds, he froze. Then, a nearby guard's head was suddenly rolling on the ground. Turns out, the sword didn't just possess people, it turned them into bloodthirsty demons. Ichijo, one of the explorers, had no choice but to unleash his divine powers and slice the poor guy down. Meanwhile, manager Miura, who had all the common sense of a moth flying into a bonfire, decided to bring the sword back home. He added it to his collection because nothing says responsible adult like collecting cursed weapons. As he admired the blade, he saw the faces of the dead reflected in it, grinning at him. Ichijo, having the bare minimum level of intelligence, excused himself to leave. But before he could go, another mess started elsewhere. On a luxurious yacht, a group of armed men stormed in, demanding the sword from its owner. But just as the guy tried to fight back, the sword devoured him. Chaos erupted, and the yacht was soon bathed in fire and blood. At the same time, back at Miura's place, the sword started glowing ominously, because nothing screams good decision like keeping an ancient death blade indoors. Hypnotized by its beauty, Miura picked it up, and because he had the survival instincts of a potato, he was instantly possessed. Within seconds, he was moving like a gust of wind, tearing through guards like they were made of paper. Bullets had about as much effect on him as a stern lecture would on a rebellious teenager. In no time, the hallway was piled with bodies, and Miura was gone, vanished. Meanwhile, in another part of the world, a woman was peacefully reading a book, awaiting the birth of her first child. Her husband, clearly excited about his new dad status, had no idea that fate was about to punch him in the face. That night, the temple, which had been keeping the sword in check, began chanting to suppress its evil. One of the monks, proving that curiosity really does kill, stepped forward. He cut his hand and let his blood soak the cloth covering the sword. Just as it seemed like they were finally sealing the blade's power, the cloth disappeared. The monk, now with the IQ of a peanut, grabbed the sword and licked it, because apparently tasting ancient cursed weapons is a thing now. Within seconds, he transformed into a monster. The temple became a slaughterhouse. The more blood the sword absorbed, the stronger it became. Meanwhile, the happy couple from earlier had just returned from the hospital and went shopping. The husband, about to reveal the name they had chosen for their baby, suddenly froze. A crimson fountain erupted from his head. Takashi was dead. His wife, now drowning in grief, cried over his body. But when she looked up, she saw the bloodthirsty monk standing there, completely unbothered. Then the monk walked onto the street and started killing like it was an extreme sport. The city fell into chaos. People ran, screamed, and did everything except fight back. Once the sword had its fill of blood, the monk snapped back to his senses, only to be stabbed from behind. His attacker, the pregnant woman? Turns out grief turns you into an Avenger, but something was wrong. As she collapsed, the sword pulsed, reacting to her. She escaped into an alley, clutching the sword. A silent struggle began, her will against the blades. As the streetlights flickered, she emerged. A young girl, just returning from work, unknowingly crossed paths with her, but for some reason the pregnant woman controlled herself. Perhaps sensing another unborn child, she resisted, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't let go of the sword. and when she looked in the mirror, she saw not her own reflection but a demon staring back at her. Meanwhile, back with Miura, the Shidai soldiers finally found him. They politely asked him to drop the sword, but Miura, now completely unhinged, responded by trying to kill them instead. Their advanced weapons were about as useful as a water gun against a forest fire. Then another lunatic, Flamberge, entered the scene. He had his own cursed weapon and shared the same dream, total destruction. But there was a problem. There could only be one King of Chaos. The two maniacs clashed, their blades glowing with insane power. Miura, now a full-fledged monster, had the upper hand. Flamberge fought hard but was ultimately no match. Meanwhile, back in the alley, the pregnant woman reached her limit. Unable to escape the sword's influence, she made a final, tragic decision. She ended her own life. But as her body hung lifeless, a baby's cry echoed through the forests. A man arrived and picked up the newborn. The child had survived. The sword's curse lived on. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Years passed, and life continued like shit didn't even happen. Life went on without care. That useless, abandoned boy managed to grow into a teenager. Sayaka, who always seemed lost in her own thoughts, got invited to a karaoke lunch by her friends. Of course, she declined again, proving once more that she had the social skills of a rock. Later, her friends asked about Ishi, the poor soul who confessed his feelings to her. Ishi was quite popular among the girls, but Sayaka rejected him like a burnt piece of toast. She didn't even have the words to explain, just awkwardly apologized and ran. After school, Sayaka got escorted home by Tatsumi. On the way, they ran into Guy, a walking brick wall of emotions. Sayaka ran after him to thank him for saving her, but he ignored her like she was a telemarketer. Tatsumi, always ready to throw hands, got angry when Guy barely even acknowledged Sayaka. Guy let himself get knocked down and still showed zero remorse. At that moment, Sayaka's father arrived, looking as stressed as someone trying to file taxes at the last minute. The Shiryu sword was thirsty for more blood, so they rushed to perform another purification ceremony. Meanwhile, the old master took Guy to the mountains for a little sentimental trip to worship his late mother. Having adopted Guy a decade ago, the master wanted to pass on his wisdom, but Guy, in all his infinite stupidity, had only one dream: to become a blacksmith. Later that night, he went to the Shiryu sword and opened its sheath, treating it like his mother. If only that sword could ground him for being such an edgy loner. Elsewhere, the Grand Hall was alive with celebrations as people admired the artifacts set for auction. Mickey, the ultimate distraction-prone fool, completely forgot his job and got lost in food and drinks. He ended up chatting with a wise, wheelchair-bound young master who, unlike Mickey, actually knew something about fine wine. The young man quickly realized that Mickey wasn't interested in the auction, which wasn't surprising. Suddenly, while raising a toast, the auctioneer called Mickey's name. This fool hadn't even realized it was his turn. After the first auction session ended, everyone moved to the second hall to admire other artifacts. Mickey, always the last to catch on, finally approached a sword with exquisite engravings. Using his tech-enhanced eyes, he determined its authenticity, feeling proud of himself for once. The man in the wheelchair also had his eyes on this particular sword. Once wielded by the legendary alchemist Paracelsus, the blade had a dark past. Paracelsus had sold his soul to a demon to perfect the Philosopher's Stone, but later decided, nah, I'm keeping it. The demon, obviously not cool with that, was defeated by humans and sealed inside the sword using the Philosopher's Stone. A classic case of mess around and find out. After the auction, Marcus returned to his car and confirmed the sword was genuine. Meanwhile, Tatsumi went tattling to his master about Guy hanging around with the Shiryu sword. But the master, unfazed as always, didn't care. Guy had always handled the sword like it was his lifelong companion, which honestly was kind of creepy. The master just wanted Tatsumi to realize how dangerous Guy really was. If Guy kept clinging to that sword, one day it would cleave him in two. The next day, the ritual to pacify Shiryu began. All the disciples were blindfolded as usual. Guy approached his master, waiting for Sayaka to bring the sword. The master handed Guy a small knife. With his usual lack of self-preservation, Guy cut his own hand and let the blood drip onto the sword. Tatsumi, unable to stomach the fact that Guy was somehow more special than him, disobeyed orders and removed his blindfold. Big mistake. The demon inside the sword broke free and possessed Sayaka. Guy lost an arm in the process. Sayaka snapped back to consciousness before promptly passing out again. A week later, Guy was still in pain from his missing arm, but Sayaka, as clueless as ever, had no idea what had happened during the ceremony. Her father, who clearly had no patience for explaining things, avoided her like a debt collector. Feeling guilty, Sayaka tried to comfort Guy, but he ran off to his mother's grave, filled with rage. His deep hatred for his mother grew, and in a grand display of teenage angst, he fainted. The master, ever the caretaker, returned to the sword, pleading with it to protect Guy since they had been together since his birth. If that wasn't the most tragic mother-son relationship, nothing was. Determined to make the sword more powerful, the master tried to destroy it, but that was about as successful as trying to punch a tornado. Meanwhile, the second auction began. Marcus, fixated on winning, immediately bid 500,000. But Mickey, always ready to throw away money like a clueless rich kid, doubled the bid every time. The two engaged in a bidding war until Mickey, being the reckless idiot he was, won. After securing his overpriced prize, he rushed back to Shashi, thinking he had achieved something great. Unfortunately, on a dark and lonely road, Marcus wasn't about to let things go. Blocking Mickey's car, he demanded to know why this man was so obsessed with the sword. If Mickey refused to hand it over, things would get ugly. Two burly men stepped out of Marcus's car, ready to handle things the old-fashioned way, but Mickey, not one to back down, swiftly took down both of them. Just as he turned around, Miura appeared. Kyoka, caught off guard, recognized her former acquaintance. Mickey had heard rumors but wasn't too surprised. However, when he saw Miura wielding the demon sword, he realized this was no joke. Fear crept in, but he tried to act tough. Kyoka, being the only sane one, urged Mickey to leave, but Mickey, never one to make smart decisions, refused. Drawing his own thunder sword, he prepared to fight. Meanwhile, back in the chaos of Guy's cursed existence, something even crazier happened. His severed arm grew back, but instead of a normal human limb, it had turned into solid iron. Back to the fight, Miura unleashed his strongest form and completely destroyed Mickey's confidence. Mickey, as the new master of losing, found himself cornered like a rat in a trap. Realizing he had no chance of winning, he struck a desperate lightning blow with the thunder sword and barely escaped with his life. The only thing he left behind was his dignity and, unfortunately, the Azoth sword. Marcus, like a true opportunist, snatched it up before Mickey even knew what happened. The next morning, Guy was on his knees in front of his master, confused and looking like the clueless fool he always was. He wanted to know why Thorrow had been used on him. The master, probably tired of dealing with Guy's lack of brain cells, explained what happened 10 years ago and why Shiryu needed a guardian. Guy, being the obedient simpleton that he was, followed orders without question. He lit a fire and chopped off the sheath of Shiryu before tossing it into the flames. Tatsumi, who was still bitter that Guy had been chosen instead of him, fumed silently in the background. The master knew Shiryu was a living sword that couldn't just be given to any random fool, yet here he was handing it to Guy. He hoped that somehow Guy would be able to forge the perfect sword, which was laughable considering Guy's track record. Meanwhile, Marcus was having a mental breakdown. Even after obtaining the sword, he couldn't stop dreaming about the demon inside it. He regretted everything, but it was too late. The voice of his sister snapped him back to reality. His family adored him, especially his sister, who always showed him love. Too bad it was all fake. The entire family had been hired by Marcus himself. When he loudly ordered them to leave, he was left alone in his dark and empty room. The perfect environment for his villain origin story. He then went ahead and drew a summoning circle for the sword. Despite all his desperate begging, the sword refused to respond. What Marcus didn't know was that Shashi was watching his every move, probably judging him silently. Marcus had lost everything. 2 years ago, his parents and sister were gone because of a theft. Now he was about to lose even more. His ex-girlfriend had moved on, fallen in love with someone else, and was about to get married. Marcus wanted to be there, but he knew he couldn't. He watched from a distance as she walked away, remembering how they once played together, promising to love him forever. Turns out forever meant until someone better came along. The rage built up inside him. The sword sensed his thirst for vengeance and latched onto him like a parasite. Before he knew it, it had entered his body, binding them together. On another side of town, Tatsumi was up to his usual creepy behavior, following Sayaka as she walked home. He confessed that he had rejected a matchmaking meeting because he wanted to be with her forever. Sayaka, showing the intelligence she rarely displayed, ignored him. That didn't sit well with Tatsumi. In a moment of absolute stupidity, he grabbed Sayaka and pushed her against a tree, attempting something vile. But before he could do anything, Guy showed up like a hero from a discount action movie. With a single light tap, he sent Tatsumi crashing to the ground. Guy's eyes turned completely red as he was about to end Tatsumi for good, but Sayaka screamed like a malfunctioning alarm clock. That annoying sound snapped Guy back to reality. He was still in pain from his arm, which wouldn't stop making strange noises. Only when Sayaka hugged him did Shiryu finally calm down. Meanwhile, Erika and Tan's wedding was happening in secret, just like she had planned. As they exchanged rings, Marcus showed up and completely ruined the moment. The two betrayers were shocked to see Marcus standing on his own 2 feet. Master Amon, because of this chaotic story, had to leave his mansion for a while. The girl responsible for delivering the sword had to ask her disciple to store the spear safely. Tamaki, the always in-the-know guy, overheard their conversation. With the power of the Oath Sword, Marcus became an unstoppable force. He charged at the betrayers like a storm, ready to end them. But just as he was about to land the final blow, Mickey jumped in. He probably realized Marcus was being controlled by the sword and wanted to stop him before he did something irreversible. While they were distracted, the stone imprisoning the demon turned into a shadow and escaped. Tanab and Erika, proving once again how unreliable they were, ran for their lives. Marcus, despite everything, managed to regain control at the last second. The fleeting image of a happy Erika brought him back to his senses. Mickey, showing up late as usual, managed to calm Marcus down and took him back to headquarters for an examination. The reality was that Marcus only knew the legend of the sword, but had no idea about its true power. Azoth could take human sorrow and transform it into a desire to kill. Tatsumi, who had been eaten alive by his jealousy, was now completely consumed by darkness. He had turned into a demon, driven by nothing but rage. Meanwhile, Guy, who was still trying to forge a sword, was suddenly attacked by Tatsumi. The once annoying rival was now a full-blown monster, eyes completely white and overflowing with darkness. The battlefield had been set. Shadai was a place where those chosen by the swords would gather and undergo deep sleep before they could control their powers. Guy, being his usual clueless self, had no idea what was happening. He resisted with everything he had, even though he barely understood what he was fighting. Tatsumi, now nothing more than a wild beast, showed no hesitation. The battle between them would determine everything. Guy was untrained, outmatched, and clearly running out of luck. But for once, he had no choice but to fight for real. Shiryu transformed into a terrifying force, and suddenly Guy, the so-called hero, became a weapon. Not that he needed any help looking ridiculous, he was already one bad decision away from self-destruction. The two engaged in a chaotic, no-holds-barred battle. Eamon, sensing the murderous intent, hurried back to the mansion, but instead of a showdown, he found Sayaka lying unconscious. Meanwhile, Guy and his opponent had dragged their nonsense deep into the forest where they could go all out without interruptions. Marcus, on the other hand, got dragged back to Shash Shadai. Kyoka took the lead in guiding him, assuring him that he would be safe here. Everyone greeted him warmly like he was some lost prince. Meanwhile, Mickey was busy undergoing a checkup. His body had changed so much that he barely looked human anymore. He was evolving, though not in a cool way. Instead of turning into a powerful warrior, he looked more like he was transforming into a ghost. While Marcus was getting interrogated by the 3 big bosses of Shashi, they wanted to know what he remembered from when he was possessed. Unfortunately, Marcus had the memory span of a goldfish and only recalled darkness. Still, the heads hyped him up, acting like he was some chosen savior. According to them, Marcus was humanity's only hope. Meanwhile, Mickey, fresh out of his medical checkup, wasted no time and went straight to kissing his girlfriend. Apparently, they hadn't been intimate for a while, and Mickey, in his infinite wisdom, feared she would leave him. Even while hibernating, he clung to the hope of waking up just to set a record-breaking kiss. That day, the sky turned an eerie red, setting the perfect stage for Guy's latest episode of recklessness. He wandered through a city overrun by the undead searching for Tatsumi. Tatsumi had merged with Tombakiri, gaining incredible abilities, making him an even bigger pain to deal with. Guy, despite having the strategic thinking of a soggy paper bag, attacked from above. He barely managed to escape before thrusting a spear straight through Tatsumi. This entire mess was being monitored from an airplane, probably by some poor soul questioning their life choices. After the interrogation, Marcus reunited with Mickey. It was a touching moment in the sense that Marcus hugged Mickey like a lost child clinging to his teddy bear. Kyoka led them to where Azoth was stored, but soon after she received orders regarding Guy's appearance. Even after a full-blown machine gun attack, Guy stood there completely unharmed. Kyoka couldn't make sense of it. How is this guy still alive? Was it dumb luck or sheer ignorance of danger? After another brutal battle, Guy finally returned to normal. Well, as normal as he could be, but then in his usual dramatic fashion, he started choking himself as if he suddenly decided that breathing was optional. His master, realizing Guy was a lost cause, sacrificed his own hand to snap him out of it. Meanwhile, Shashi had gathered an arsenal of incredibly powerful weapons, far beyond human comprehension. Those who got possessed and merged with swords were known as chrysalis. The name made it sound poetic, but in reality it meant they would either evolve into something powerful or spiral into madness. If a chrysalis couldn't hibernate, their evolution would accelerate uncontrollably. These unfortunate souls would become busoma, monstrous beings fused with their weapons, completely consumed by bloodlust. Mira was one of them. Unlike Guy, who stumbled through life cluelessly, Mira wielded his sword with absolute control and deadly intent. His target was a prison filled with the worst criminals. He wanted to absorb the hatred within these wretched people, making his sword stronger with every kill. Meanwhile, Marcus was blissfully unaware of any of this. He had been tossed into a glass cage to hibernate, while another chrysalis, Ichijo, was released. The next morning, Sayaka went searching for Guy, but of course the fool was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Tatsumi, despite having a sword wound that should have taken him out, somehow survived. But instead of reflecting on life, he was busy drowning in twisted thoughts. Guy, after everything, was acting strangely. It was as if he had regressed into a toddler. He refused to speak and behaved like some lost puppy. He even played outside with butterflies, yes, butterflies like a little princess, until his cursed arm caused them to disintegrate. Even in peace, Guy was a disaster waiting to happen. Elsewhere, Iko woke up after 16 years and 24 days of slumber. The first person he met was Kyoka. Meanwhile, Mua, the previous manager, had been completely corroded by his sword. It was a tragic end, but no one had time to dwell on it. Sayaka and her father went looking for Guy, but he didn't respond. Maybe he was avoiding them. Maybe he was just being his usual useless self. Or maybe, just maybe, he had finally realized the burden of carrying power he barely understood. Instead of stepping up, Guy had retreated into some childlike state. It seemed like a pathetic excuse to avoid responsibility, but in reality, Shuntaro's power had overwhelmed him. Whatever awaited him next, one thing was certain: Guy wasn't ready for it. Ichijo, with his grand title and all, was supposed to be a big deal. He's supposed to be Vishnu, the supreme deity. He got orders to track down Guy, the walking disaster from the day before. Kyoka, working with Ichijo for the first time, had only heard bits and pieces about him. Ancient Indian legends spoke of a kingdom that ticked off the gods. Big mistake. The gods in return sent a divine smackdown, wiping the entire nation off the map and leaving behind a ring of light, a divine weapon sealed away for good. Ichijo was the only one who could handle it, which of course made him the biggest fish in Shash. Meanwhile, Guy, our favorite clueless mess, was wandering around like a lost puppy before stopping at a statue. Then, like the overly dramatic fool he was, he started sobbing in the rain. Sayaka, knowing his tiny emotional brain needed a break, comforted him. Her father went back to smithing, still struggling to create a sword that could cut through human consciousness. Apparently, stuffing Shiryu inside his disciple had caused quite the controversy, but Amon had his reasons. Shiryu had been Guy's guardian since birth, the only thing keeping his empty head in check. However, rumors swirled about a twin sword. If true, the one in Guy's possession was the weaker version, which, considering Guy's luck, made perfect sense. Somewhere else, in another forge, a woman close to Amon and her disciple were working on an absurdly sharp sword. She was obsessed with blades, going so far as to lick them. Her poor disciple, meanwhile, was just trying not to faint. She even wanted to be cut by her own disciple just to feel the blade's sharpness. Clearly, therapy was needed, but no one was saying it out loud. That night, Sayaka was busy sewing a new outfit for Guy. While she was changing, some creep was watching intently. Festival day rolled around and she dragged Guy through every corner, making him eat and play festival games. He looked confused as usual. Meanwhile, at the sharpening shop, a mysterious customer dropped off his sword, throwing in an absurd amount of cash for a rush job. The girl sharpening the sword had no clue she was dealing with Shiryu. The moment she started working, a horrible shriek filled the air. Then, to add nightmare fuel, an eye popped open on the blade. Kiyomi was instantly possessed. The sword craved blood. Realizing a photo of Eamon had been destroyed, she frantically sent her disciple away. The screams got louder, so she did the only logical thing. She used her own blood to shut it up. That night elsewhere, Miura sat alone playing the piano like some brooding anime villain. Right on cue, his old enemy appeared. Swords have this annoying habit of seeking each other out for dominance. The fire sword had lost to the demon sword before, and now they were going to settle things once and for all. Two spectators sat in the shadows watching the fight unfold. They admired the sharpness of the demon sword, which, surprise, surprise, won again. Back at the festival, Sayaka decided it was temple time. She dragged Guy to pray for divine protection. She probably knew his luck was too bad for a normal life. She wanted to spend more time with him, but of course drama found them. Tatsumi showed up like the absolute pest he was, tracking them down by following a butterfly on Sayaka's shirt. Shiryu, acting on pure instinct, raised its hand to defend her. Just as Tatsumi was about to cut off Sayaka's head, a glowing ring flew through the air. Ichijo had found what he was hunting. Meanwhile, at the forge, Kiyomi had exhausted herself trying to sharpen Shiryu. The sketchy customer vanished quickly. Ichijo and Tatsumi clashed in a fierce fight, and things got even weirder when Guy's arm reacted to Ayo's ring. With a burst of power, the ring trapped Tatsumi, shattering him into pieces. Just as Ichijo was about to walk away like he owned the place, he noticed Shuntaro's eye locked onto him. Turns out Ichijo wasn't hunting Guy, he was the true target. Ichijo wasted no time and shoved Guy away like he was tossing out yesterday's pizza. Sayaka rushed to defend him, but let's be real, she and Guy were about as useful as a stick of broom. Ichijo was on a different level. Then Mr. Kaido appeared out of nowhere, probably just enjoying the drama, and let the three into his house. He asked why Shashi wanted the human equivalent of a soggy napkin. Ichijo was just following orders. If Guy turned into a busoma, he was getting erased from existence. Kaido, having lived long enough to see every type of idiot, knew Ichijo's type well. But before things could settle, a giant, weird-looking dude stepped in. This was Swan from Gabi, a rival organization to Shidai. Since a forest can't have two tigers, they immediately started throwing hands. Sayaka, sensing that things were about to get worse, pleaded with Kaido to stop the fight, but he was enjoying the show. Ichijo, being the overconfident god he was, underestimated Soen at first. Bad idea. The fight escalated, and Ichijo had to bring out his chakum. Someone was going down, and it wasn't going to be pretty. Then, from Soen's shadow, fingers started sprouting like some nightmare fuel. Guy, in a moment of absolute genius, threw a rock at it, and by some miracle, it actually hit Soen's leg. Soen, offended that he was hit by something so pathetic, just turned around and walked away, abandoning the fight like a bad Tinder date. Then, in classic villain fashion, he shoved Sayaka aside and grabbed Guy by the neck, probably wondering how someone this useless kept surviving. Before Soen could turn Guy into a pancake, Abusa jumped out of the shadows and stabbed Soen like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Turns out this was the prey he had been hunting for ages. Not one to waste time, the Busoma hurled a knife at Guy. Since Guy's entire existence is just a sequence of bad decisions, this was apparently what he needed to awaken. Bleeding but suddenly filled with rage, he charged at the Busoma, screaming like a banshee and stabbing it with aggression. Sayaka looked at him like she had just seen a whole new person. Despite getting sliced in two, the Busoma somehow survived, dropping a smoke bomb and fleeing like a dog with its tail beat. No one even bothered to chase it. Ichijo, however, was done playing around. He was laser focused on knowing if Guy would eventually become a Basuma, so he can go ahead to erase Guy from existence. Guy, being himself, was obviously no match. After getting knocked down, he blacked out. When he woke up, he had no idea what had happened. Ichijo was just about to finish him off when Kaido, in true weirdo fashion, climbed on top of Ichijo and started sniffing him. Yes, sniffing. This was so unsettling that even Ichijo, the guy who fights monsters daily, was visibly uncomfortable. Despite his desire to kill Guy, Ichijo couldn't off the old man since only he knew where Guy was hiding. They agreed to keep some distance, probably realizing that being near each other was just a headache. Ichijo, now forced to lie in the rain like a sad anime protagonist, had no choice but to wait. Meanwhile, Kaido met with Amon. After hearing what had happened, Amon reluctantly spilled the tea on Guy's tragic backstory. Turns out Guy's mother Shiryu had a tough time. He was stuck in her womb for so long that she straight up died, leaving him alone in the world. Harsh. When Guy finally woke up, his wounds were miraculously healed, but his memory was gone, which honestly was probably for the best. Sayaka, trying to be comforting, got pushed away because Guy was allergic to kindness. Despite running from everything, he always found his way back home, knowing that darkness followed him everywhere. His only solution was to destroy the world and break free from the darkness. Sayaka, refusing to accept that Guy was basically an emotional black hole, kept trying to talk sense into him, but their perspectives were worlds apart. Guy, ever the stubborn fool, appreciated Amon, but didn't see him as a father, completely oblivious to how much the Guy cared. Only Amon knew the real legend of Shiryu. During the Mirachi period, there was a temple dedicated to Dragonhorn. A priest there got greedy, stole something, and opened it with his wife. Bad move. The light inside blinded them, and a dragon burst out, entering the woman's body. She instantly got pregnant and gave birth to a half-human, half-dragon child. Instead of celebrating their new dragon baby, the heartless parents threw him in a river like unwanted leftovers and got zapped by lightning. Karma hit hard. The dragon child was found and raised by a blacksmith. Life was good. He got married, had a cute kid, and things were looking up. But then, word of his existence reached the Shogun, who demanded that he forge the ultimate sword. Forced to obey, the Dragon Boy had to reveal his face. This, of course, led to the Shogun being the Shogun. His wife and kid were killed because why not? To make things worse, no blade could cut the Dragon Boy, so they exiled him to the sea, leaving him to fend for himself. When he eventually returned home, he was consumed by rage. He decided to forge two swords, one to take his own life and the other to behead the Shogun. Afterward, both Shiryu swords vanished, but legends say their shadows appear to someone special, granting them power over life and death. Ichijo, the tough warrior, was so moved by this tale that he straight up cried his eyes out, 2 full rivers of tears, snot running like a faucet. But as much as he felt for the Dragon Boy's tragic life, he wasn't about to let Guy go. At dawn, he patiently waited for Guy's return. This time, Ichijo did something unexpected. He extended his hand to Guy, inviting him to another world, Shash Shidai. Guy, confused as ever, looked to his master for answers. The decision was his alone. Sayaka, refusing to let him go without a fight, ran after the car, yelling like a dramatic anime heroine. Meanwhile, the other half of Shiryu, sensing that its counterpart was finally making a move, couldn't stay still any longer. It was time for the final pieces to fall into place. Once in Ichijo's car, Guy realized he had made a terrible mistake. The car was terrifying and he was stuck in it like a clueless potato. They arrived at a house overflowing with flowers, and Guy had no clue what was happening. Ichijo, on the other hand, had the emotional depth of a teaspoon but was suddenly shaken when the door opened. Standing there was his long-lost love, Kei, who had been waiting for him for 16 years. Meanwhile, Ichijo, the fossil that he was, hadn't aged a day. Kei, for some reason, thought they had just watched a movie the day before. Ichijo pulled Guy aside like some secret agent with bad news and told him that they were all doomed to become busoma. The only way to stop it was hibernation. Guy, being his usual clueless self, just stared, probably wondering what hibernation even meant. Ichijo had just woken up after 16 years, and somehow Kei still believed they were a normal couple. Either she had the patience of a saint, or she was just really good at pretending things were fine. Ichijo, the eternal grandpa, wanted to make it up to her. Meanwhile, Guy was thrown into the worst situation imaginable, a crowded fighting arena. Instead of an intense physical battle, it was just 2 people sitting at gaming consoles. While the crowd cheered, Ichijo was lost in his love for Kei, reminiscing about all their old memories like a sentimental old man. Kay, on the other hand, was in pain. She couldn't even paint her toenails anymore. She started recalling all their past moments, every place they visited, and she longed to return to the lake where Ichijo once retrieved a hat for her. But just as she was about to indulge in nostalgia, a call from the hospital reminded her that she had a stroke treatment scheduled. She wasn't expected to survive another episode. Ichijo, the drama queen, silently went upstairs upon hearing this. When he saw that all the mirrors were covered, reality hit him like a truck. Back at the battle arena, the victorious girl was gloating, thinking she was unbeatable, but her opponent wasn't having it. He tracked her down in the restroom, acting all grateful for saving his life. She didn't care one bit and shattered his illusions before arrogantly walking away. Later, when she encountered the boy again, she couldn't help herself and started hitting him with her bag like an angry grandmother. This pushed the boy over the edge and he snapped, attacking her. But then, like some cursed fairy tale, the fire sword sensed a perfect new host. Mito, now obsessed with the sword, didn't hesitate to grab it and go on a rampage. Meanwhile, at the peaceful river, Ichijo and Kei were having a moment. They played together like the old days, but then pain struck again. Kei, seeing her reflection in the water, became melancholic. On the other side of town, Mito was losing her mind, and Guy, being his usual useless self, got knocked down. But for once, he actually did something. He merged with his sword and fought Mito. As a gamer, he was more agile than the average idiot, but still, he struggled. Back at home, Kei asked Ichijo to open the wardrobe. Inside was her wedding dress, the one she had dreamed of wearing. She put it on, feeling immense happiness, but then the pain came again. Lying on the bed, she admitted that she had always considered Ichijo an illusion. Despite that, she loved him deeply. Ichijo, with tears in his eyes, kissed her, saying his final goodbye. Then, like a true workaholic, he returned to his duties. Guy, now left alone to deal with Mito's madness, was completely overwhelmed. But then, like an action hero arriving at the last second, Ichijo showed up just in time. Mito had no choice but to run away. Ichijo, unable to chase her, simply led Guy away from the sorrowful city, leaving the madness behind. On the vast, endless sea, a bloated mass of laziness named Yasuko reclined on a yacht, sipping her cocktail like she owned the ocean. Just as she was about to enjoy another sip, she summoned poor Billy. The unfortunate soul cursed to serve her. The moment he arrived, she drenched him with water, probably to remind him of his lowly place in life. His only crime? Serving Yasuko's greasy, overfed existence. Both of them were on the same treasure hunt, but their motivations were worlds apart. Billy had a noble dream, buying a house for his parents. Yasuko, on the other hand, had been inactive for so long that she suddenly craved something fresh and young, as if being a menace to society was a lifestyle choice. Just as Billy prepared himself for the worst, a bald man shot out of the water, flailing like a fish that had made a terrible mistake. The bald man claimed he had found the legendary treasure of Thorrow. The entire yacht crew gathered in excitement, hearts pounding at the thought of unimaginable riches. Yasuko greedily ripped the treasure chest open, expecting piles of gold, but instead it was full of liquor bottles. A treasure indeed for drunks. The yacht crew deflated like a sad balloon, realizing they were duped. Yasuko naturally was livid. She didn't drag this circus of fools across the ocean for a floating bar. Back on land, far from this mess, in a renowned hair salon, a long-haired stylist named Issei was living the dream of every woman. Just by touching a girl's hair, he could read her like a book. Every night, girls lined up hoping for a makeover from the handsome stylist who seemed almost too perfect. A girl, despite getting scolded, left with her hair shining like a goddess had blessed it. Meanwhile, the treasure hunt remained a failure. The yacht crew, instead of making progress, spent their time blabbering about why they were there in the first place. Each had their own reason for seeking Thorrow's treasure, but the most interesting one came from an old professor. He longed to see Galen's hammer, a legendary weapon that once belonged to the infamous pirate Thorrow. Many years ago, under the king's watchful eye, brutal tournaments were held where warriors fought to the death. The victor always wielded Galen's sword. One day, a knight approached Galen, pretending to want an alliance. Instead, he slaughtered him in cold blood, putting an end to the legendary blacksmith's craft. Galen's son, filled with grief, cradled his father's body and wept for 3 straight days. As his tears dried, he heard a strange hum. It was Galen's hammer, calling to him. Empowered by grief, the son entered the next tournament and obliterated his opponents, breaking their swords like they were made of twigs. His victory was absolute, but the paranoid king, fearing the hammer's power, poisoned him. As he coughed up blood and collapsed, the hammer absorbed the curse. The kingdom soon fell, and whispers spread that the hammer had taken control of the king himself. Yasuko, of course, was entirely uninterested in this tragic history. She only cared about one thing, a massive pile of gold. On the opposite end of the personality spectrum, Issei used his fame for wealth and, surprisingly, murder. His ideal woman only needed to have long, beautiful hair so he could kill her. A romantic at heart, truly. Years ago, Issei had witnessed his sister's tragic death. Instead of seeking justice like a normal person, he fixated on a woman with long hair, blaming her for existing. He became obsessed with finding the most beautiful hair just so he could end its owner. Back on the yacht, just as everyone was about to give up, fate threw them a bone. They actually found Thorrow's treasure. Yasuko, in an absolute frenzy, squeezed Billy so hard he probably lost a year of his life. Laughter filled the air, but the celebration was cut short when they realized someone was missing. Dick, a crew member, had mysteriously vanished. Yasuko, annoyed at having to care about someone else, led the search only to find Dick was already dead. How inconvenient. Meanwhile, Issei's personal horror movie continued. The day he had finally found the golden-haired woman, he was ready to end her. But before he could, she casually mentioned a legendary sword he was destined to receive. Inside it lived a snow spirit cursed by a tragic love story. Two country boys had once fought for her affection. The loser, while dying, whispered one last wish, for the snow spirit to hold him. Touched by his words, the spirit stepped onto the earth for the first time. In that moment, the man broke his own rib and stabbed her heart. The rib, soaked in tragedy, became a bloodthirsty sword. Back on the yacht, panic erupted. Everyone was now convinced there was a murderer among them. The old professor, the only one missing, became the prime suspect, and the bald man, probably regretting all his life choices, went to search for him. Swannon, the professor's agonized screams echoed across the yacht. The entire crew rushed to the scene, leaving Yasuko behind. When she finally caught up, everyone was already dead, including the captain. Yasuko, for the first time in her life, had no words. Then, before she could process anything, the professor attacked her from behind, revealing himself as the true villain. He wanted the treasure for himself, but karma worked fast. Within seconds, he met his end. Billy, somehow still alive, had saved Yasuko. For once in her miserable existence, Yasuko felt gratitude. Then, proving that humans are predictable, Billy turned on her. The treasure was right there, and he wanted it. A struggle ensued, and Yasuko ended up tumbling into the sea. Normally, that would be the end of her, but fate had other plans. As she flailed in the water, she spotted something glowing beneath her. Galen's legendary hammer. The girl who had her hair done earlier left the salon, fully aware that Issei was watching her. He didn't care about her beauty, he wanted answers. Why had she killed his sister? But the blonde woman was as heartless as they came. Without hesitation, she pulled out a hidden sword from within her body, the very blade that housed the snow spirit. Issei, merged with the sword, screamed in absolute agony. The hunter had become the prey. Hours later, Billy, still stranded on the yacht, noticed a boat drifting nearby. Hope surged through him. Finally, rescue was near. Just as he thought he was about to be saved, Yasuko rose from the ocean like an unstoppable sea monster, and in her hands, Galen's hammer gleamed with terrifying power. Billy's life had just taken a turn for the worse. Days later, the cursed duo Issei and Yasuko finally met in reality. There were many weapons beyond human understanding. Shashi now had his eyes set on Canada, the offspring of a human father and a spirit mother. This guy was born with knowledge and strength way beyond that of ordinary people. At 18, Canada received the halberd from his mother, who gave him some cheesy speech about using it for justice. If used for evil, the wielder would be doomed. Canada took those words to heart, went to the battlefield, and like some overpowered anime protagonist, destroyed 100 enemies to protect his village. But when he returned home, his beloved Sarah had married some nerdy doctor. Instead of just moving on like a normal person, Canada lost his mind and used his precious sword to turn them into history. That was the moment this so-called hero became a full-blown demon. He massacred his own village, including his parents, before finally dying in a bloodbath. The halberd was lost, and now Mickey and Marcus had to retrieve it. Their mission was to target the real estate mogul Seiya Shai, who had somehow gotten his greedy hands on the weapon. Mina joined in to infiltrate Seiya's information network. Meanwhile, Ichijo was still crying over his lost love, Kei like a lovesick fool. Her words haunted his mind. On the other hand, Guy, the biggest slacker in history, was barely eating, still obsessed with returning to where he belonged. He didn't care how long he had to hibernate, but nobody knew when he would wake up. By then, the world might be unrecognizable, and the people he once knew might be nothing but dust. Mickey met Mina and, instead of focusing on the mission, got caught up in a passionate kiss. Marcus, the third wheel, could only watch in silence. Their organization had strict rules against romance, so their little moment was a secret. Thanks to Mina's skills, they reached the top floor of the headquarters with no trouble. Marcus, always full of brilliant but reckless ideas, decided to use his Azoth sword to envelop them in darkness. They snuck into the ventilation system, but Marcus, born into wealth, almost threw up from the stench. Barely holding himself together, he reached the bottom. They managed to open the safe, but the sword was locked behind a double-layered security system. Marcus, as clueless as ever, got caught in a trap, triggering the alarm. Poison gas started filling the room and the ventilation shut down. Mina scrambled to find a way out while Marcus, the genius, tried to use his power only to realize the gas affected them too. Just when things seemed hopeless, the director of the facility arrived. Mina bluffade om att göra en medicinsk kontroll, men direktören såg rätt igenom hennes lögner. Turns out he had been using the halberd for himself. Hearing Mina's scream, Mickey rushed in like a knight in shining armor, but she was thrown back, forced to retreat. Mickey, injured but stubborn, refused to let the director escape. Marcus took advantage of a blind spot and sliced the man in two. With his death, the halberd suddenly merged into Mickey's body. He screamed in agony, but no one could do anything. Later, the trio hid in an alley. Everyone was worried, but Mickey, the eternal optimist, suddenly laughed and said he was fine. His wounds had miraculously healed, so they didn't have to return to Shash Shaddai early. Marcus, understanding the need for privacy, left, allowing the couple to have their moment. Mina, still anxious about the weapon's influence on her boyfriend, pretended everything was normal. Deep inside, however, she knew something was very wrong. Halberd was whispering chaos into Mickey's mind. Ignoring the ominous presence inside him, Mickey decided to take his girlfriend to an amusement center. They tried every game there. By evening, Mickey, being the idiot he was, wanted to break a Guinness record with Mina. Just as they were enjoying their time, the halberd resurfaced. Mickey lost control and wielded both weapons like some possessed warrior. Shashi immediately sensed the disturbance and contacted Marcus. Ichijo also called, announcing that their break was over. Mina, desperate to find Mickey, ran everywhere, only to be knocked down by him. At that crucial moment, Marcus arrived to protect her. He tried to bring Mickey back to his senses. Ichijo, seeing the mess unfold, decided to help, even though his track record in actually being useful was questionable. Seconds later, Mickey completed his merger with the halberd. Though he didn't fully transform into a busoma, his strength was monstrous. The sheer power from their battle also agitated Shiryu inside Guy. Ichijo, with all his cocky confidence, got knocked down like a rag doll. Guy, the professional nap enthusiast, was finally forced to do something. The energy released was too much. Theo ran to shield Guy while Mina desperately tried to wake her boyfriend. The busoma, struggling with itself, fought against Mickey's control. In a dramatic moment, Guy finally made himself useful and shattered the armor with a single strike. Mickey, returning to his normal state, collapsed into Mina's arms. He was immediately taken back to Shash Shaddai for examination. Mickey's condition was bad. Even hibernation wouldn't work on him now. They needed to retrieve both weapons before things got worse. No one told Mina about any of this. She was just relieved that Mickey was safe. Mickey, on the other hand, felt guilty for almost killing her. Before hibernating, he made a heartfelt confession. He just wanted a normal life, to have children, and to live happily. Then, like an absolute fool, he proposed to Mina, thinking everything would be fine. Unfortunately for him, fate had other plans. Before he could fully hibernate, he transformed into a busoma. Mina could only watch silently as the heartbreaking process unfolded. The remaining Shiryu sword was throwing a tantrum, crying like a spoilt brat looking for its sibling. The rich family that owned it had no clue what to do. Despite their mountains of money, they were absolutely useless when it came to dealing with a moody sword. The The young master of the family, who had the personality of a self-righteous puppy, was more interested in doing charity work. He spent his time worrying about abandoned children and lonely elders, but for some baffling reason, he decided to house both the orphanage and the nursing home under the same roof. Meanwhile, Sayaka and her father lived on that same land. Sayaka was still hung up on Guy, blaming her father for the mess he was in. She saw Guy as a person, not just a weapon, which was either deep or incredibly foolish. Her father, Mr. Amon, had a different perspective. He knew Guy was basically a glorified sword case carrying Shu's humanity. The whole good versus evil dilemma was entirely up to Guy, which was probably the worst person to entrust with such a choice. Sayaka spent her night staring at the moon, lost in memories of Guy. As if they were connected by some ridiculous anime logic, Guy was also gazing at the moon like a dramatic protagonist. She remembered a time when they encountered a wolf as kids. Despite being a walking disaster, Guy had somehow protected her, even though he got injured doing so. They held hands on the way home, and Sayaka never forgot that moment. Unfortunately, Guy was too dense to understand what any of it meant. Just as Guy was lost in his moonlit thoughts, Ichijo interrupted him. The man was still in pain from his wounds, but he had enough energy to point out how weak Guy was. Guy was shocked to hear such truth spoken to his face. Ichijo then brought up Sayaka, hinting that Guy had someone important in his life. But since Guy had the emotional intelligence of a potato, he completely missed the point. He was convinced that living for himself was the way to go, which was exactly why he kept getting tossed around like an unlucky rag doll. If he couldn't even protect those he cared about, how could he protect himself? Back at the wealthy estate, the young master of Shiryu decided to bring in investors to decide where to build new structures. Instead of a normal discussion, the investors immediately started arguing like children fighting over a toy. Meanwhile, the young master stood there, only capable of drawing pictures instead of making decisions. Then, out of nowhere, Shin had a bright idea, combining both projects. It sounded impractical and borderline absurd, but somehow it made perfect sense. The dispute was settled, and Shin proved he had more brains than expected. Meanwhile, the young mistress of the family was still in school, pretending she no longer cared about Guy. Instead of moping, she focused on socializing and having fun with her friends. Kazumo, on the other hand, had no time for such distractions. With Soin's death weighing heavily on them, Kazumo approached Kaido, requesting a cremation. They realized they had underestimated the busoma, a creature that had now disappeared into hiding. The era of Chrysalis was coming, and to survive, Gabi needed to join forces with Shash Shidai. However, this group had an unusual approach. They refused to use weapons, relying only on divine powers. Gabi was skeptical. She was convinced that weapons would eventually turn her into a busoma, but men still had hope in Guy, despite all evidence proving that was a terrible idea. At that moment, Guy was trapped, forced to cook for Ichijo like some sort of personal chef. For someone who hated sitting still, this was pure torture. After everything that happened, Guy found himself thinking about Shash Shidai. It seemed like a place that prevented people from turning into monsters, but he couldn't understand why they were so obsessed with clinging to their humanity. Years ago, when Ichijo was still human, he was ambushed and nearly killed. Just when he thought he was done for, a divine bracelet appeared out of nowhere. The moment he wore it, his power skyrocketed, allowing him to wipe out his enemies. However, in his moment of madness, he nearly attacked his allies as well. The only thing that stopped him was a photo of himself with Kei, reminding him of his humanity. He could only hope that Guy wouldn't be consumed by the weapon in the same way. Sayaka, meanwhile, was having the time of her life with her friends, unaware of the chaos unfolding. On her way home, she accidentally bumped into Shin, who was rallying people to sign a petition. Without hesitation, she agreed to help. Unfortunately, her good deed was interrupted when a group of hooligans appeared. Shin, in his infinite wisdom, decided to step in, but got punched so hard he was knocked out immediately. Sayaka had no choice but to wait for him to wake up. The thugs, still unsatisfied, went looking for more victims. Unfortunately for them, they ran into Miko. The woman wasted no time slaughtering them all and then went straight for Sayaka's location. She was completely consumed by bloodlust. If someone didn't stop her, she would tear through everything in sight. Just in time, Guy arrived to save the day. Shin, still recovering from his earlier humiliation, noticed that the Shiryu sword was on Guy's arm. This was the same sword they had been searching for. Meanwhile, Ichijo, who had been looking for Guy, ran into Miura. Seeing his old friend in such a state broke his heart, but before he could do anything, Miura left, leaving Ichijo in pain. When Miko attacked, Guy had no choice but to merge with Shiryu to fight back. For the first time, he managed to wound Miko, shocking everyone. Realizing she was at a disadvantage, she fled, disappearing once again into the night. Sayaka, overwhelmed with emotion, wished that Guy would return to her. But, as expected, Guy pushed her away. This rejection shattered Sayaka, bringing back her old insecurities. But just when she thought she was completely alone, Shin appeared, right in her classroom, ready to shake things up yet again. Mina was now a glorified lab rat in Shash Shidai, part of some genius-level plan for Marcus's so-called evolution. The results was that she was reborn as Midoriko, the perfect fantasy girl Marcus had never asked for but somehow got anyway. Now she was his supervisor, and Marcus, being the clueless fool he was, barely had time to process it before she sauntered into the control room to mess with his brain. Her face was way too familiar, looking eerily like his ex. As expected from someone with the emotional depth of a teaspoon, Marcus fell for her charm instantly. Midoriko, enjoying the drama, started asking him all sorts of leading questions, playing mind games like a pro. She even lied straight to his face, telling him Mickey was in peaceful hibernation. He sort of believed it, but that paranoia about turning into Busoma never left him. Seeing the golden opportunity, Midoriko hugged him, and for a second he thought about Erika. Realizing he was being played like a fiddle, Marcus yanked himself away, completely embarrassed. Shash Shidai had it all planned, monitoring everything down to the last detail. Meanwhile, Yiko had been busy feeding Guy all sorts of stories about Chrysalis and Busoma. He truly believed Shash Shidai was their only hope. But Guy, being his usual skeptical and slightly useless self, didn't trust anything. Meanwhile, Shin had somehow become the class prince, using his good looks and mysteriously deep pockets to win over his classmates. Of course, the jealous boys in the school weren't having any of it. They ambushed him when he was alone, throwing insults and shaking him down for money like some low-budget gangsters. Before things got worse, Sayaka stepped in like the hero no one asked for but everyone needed. She called for the teacher, sending the bullies running, then handed Shin back his wallet. After that, Shin wouldn't leave her alone. He even asked about Guy, which instantly killed the conversation. Sayaka went quiet, clearly not wanting to discuss whatever past drama was hiding there. Back at headquarters, Yiko got chewed out by Kyoka, but her attention quickly shifted to Guy's arm, which was still looking suspiciously cursed. She told Ichijo to hibernate before things got out of hand, but he flat out refused. If he kept this up, he'd turn into Busoma, but Ichijo had unfinished business. He knew Kyoka was Miura's daughter, still carrying on her father's work. He wanted to redeem Miura's soul and grant Kyoka's wish, but Kyoka, having more common sense than half of Shash Shidai combined, wasn't sure she wanted that. Since losing her mother, her father had been her rock. When Kyoka went to retrieve a weapon from some thieves, they laughed in her face and disrespected Miura's name. Ichijo, probably realizing for the first time that things were getting out of hand, dragged Guy over to see the weapons. Guy, ever the shaky mess, almost lost control just looking at them. Chrysalis was the only thing that could fight Busoma, but the longer he used it, the closer he got to transforming himself. Theo, watching all this unfold, had no clue what was going on inside Guy's overcooked brain. As they left, they ran into Marcus, who was all smiles, greeting Guy like they were best friends. Before they could talk, Midoriko swooped in and pulled Marcus away. Meanwhile, Sayaka went out with her friends again, only to find Shin at the drawing club, entertaining the girls. Instead of drawing anything normal, he was sketching Sayaka like some love-struck fool. The peaceful vibe in the club was a stark contrast to the absolute nightmare unfolding behind the scenes. Miura, now a complete killing machine, was mowing down everything in his path. Advanced weaponry? Useless. The headquarters had discovered Busoma fighting weapons, but it didn't matter. Miura was on a whole other level. Kyoka, staring at the carnage through a screen, was speechless. Once her father had been kind and gentle. Now he was nothing but a monster, his face twisted with murderous intent. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to turn against him. Instead, she made a deal with Ichijo. He could go after Miura, but only if Guy went with him. The last time Kyoka saw her father, he had promised to come back. Now she could only watch him on a screen, a stranger covered in blood. Miura tore through the best weapons like paper, wiping out everything in sight. Seconds later, Ichijo and Guy arrived on the battlefield, ready to take him down. They tried talking first, but Miura didn't remember a thing. To him, they were just obstacles in his way. Guy stared at the man in front of him, remembering the talk he had with Guy in the car. Ichijo's time was running out. He wanted Guy to kill him when he turned into a busoma. What a wonderful world! Asking your buddy to stab you when things go south. Ichijo felt relieved, finally letting himself use his full strength, unaware that Miura had a heart full of darkness. The fool wanted to save his old friend, but the demon sword's power was overwhelming. This fight brought back memories for Ichijo. Miura always trained with his sword, obsessed with getting stronger, probably to make up for his lack of social skills. They had promised each other that if one of them lost their way, the other would step in. Now, here they were, bashing each other's skulls in. After club activities, Shin rushed to talk to Sayaka, eager to give her the painting he worked on all afternoon. Poor Guy thought a piece of art would win her over. She barely looked at it, said thanks, and walked off. Meanwhile, Miura's inner demon showed its true power, forcing Ichijo to dodge over and over like he was in a deadly game of tag. Iko managed to tie Miura up, planning to make him explode. What a fantastic plan. Unfortunately, Miura broke free and countered, sending Ichijo flying straight toward Guy. Then, in the most dramatic transformation possible, Miura fully became the sword itself, wanting Ichijo to become a busoma just like him. Guy, for all his usual stupidity, wasn't about to let his teammates suffer alone. He tried holding Miura back, giving Ichijo some time. But when Ichijo could barely stand, Guy finally did something useful and struck the demon sword in the stomach. While he was celebrating his one smart move of the day, Iko successfully created his own energy ring. Just as Guy was about to end the fight, another, taller, and even more terrifying busoma appeared. Even Shashi, who acted tough, looked like he wanted to run. This was a whole new level of nightmare fuel. Kazumo immediately ran off to inform Himiko about Soin's death because apparently things weren't chaotic enough. Back at home, Sayaka looked at Shin's painting. Ever since Guy left, she had been noticeably sad. Clearly, she had no idea that her so-called knight in shining armor was busy getting smacked around by a legendary busoma. Grimm's, the original busoma, stood before them, and Ichijo realized for the first time that running away wasn't even an option. Guy, always the genius, stood still, listening to Grimm's every word like a lost puppy. The murderous aura coming from Grimm's was enough to make Guy lose control. Meanwhile, Shin, completely unaware of all the insanity, was at a party giving a speech about world peace. The irony was incredible. He passionately argued that violence was not in human nature and that peace could only be achieved through non-violence. Meanwhile, in the real world, Guy and Ichijo were getting their faces smashed in by a nightmare creature. Trying to protect Guy, Ichijo attacked Grimm's, but he was completely drained. Grimm's swatted him away like an annoying fly. This was exactly the kind of battle that Guy, in all his stubbornness, thought he could win. Grimm's, for whatever reason, was happy to see him. The fight reached a terrifying conclusion. Both Guy and Ichijo were defeated and tossed aside, but Grimm's didn't finish them off. Standing up, Guy's mind was full of violent thoughts. His last memory of Sayaka, a photo he carried, cracked. To stop him from becoming a full busoma, Iko used his remaining strength. But in the end, even Iko couldn't watch over Guy anymore. Then it happened. Guy snapped. Like a twig, he went in full, and without hesitation, he stuck his sword through Ichijo. But what's that over there? That's a busoma. Who could it be? Hit the like and subscribe button. Let's find out if that busoma we just saw is Guy, or the anime verse is just playing tricks on us with that cliffhanger.